Thank you very much for being here. RubyConf feels really awesome this year. It's a pleasure to be here. I really love Ruby. It was interesting in Matz's keynote that he talked about the guy who was upset because we aren't all using Perl or something. In 1997, true story, I was playing around on the Sunsight EDU CD that came with like Slackware or something, and there's a whole section on languages, which was a fascinating place to be. I looked at Ruby, and I started reading the README, and I didn't get blocks at all. But I saw the references to Perl, and I had tried to learn Perl, and it was the most painful experience that I had had. C was far easier to learn than Perl. And so I closed Ruby, and I didn't come back to it until about 6 years later. At that time, the Prog book was out, and I started reading the book. And this was after doing Tickle and Python and C and C++ and Java and Smalltalk. And it clicked, and I have ever since been using Ruby, and I think it's a fantastic language. So I really, really love Ruby. Also, there's a lot of companies that love Ruby. So I work for EngineYard. EngineYard sponsored Rubinius and JRuby for a while, and maintainer for Ruby 186, and has contributed open source grants and a lot of other stuff. Good company. GitHub, we all know, probably has the cutest mascot of any project that I know. They're a fan of Ruby. Heroku, Travis, Living Social, Square, a lot of companies. Ones that I've left out, I didn't leave out for any reason other than I just sort of, these are a few. So not that many years ago, there were not that many people being paid to write Ruby. So in this room, if you are paid right now for some or all of your job to write Ruby, please stand up. Anyone who is not standing? There are tons of people hiring Ruby developers. So if you wanted to write Ruby, don't sit down. Don't sit down. If you wanted to write Ruby, you should be talking to one of the people around you who is standing up. If you only started writing Ruby for pay in the last year, please sit down. 2 years. 3 years. 4 years. 5 years. 6 years. Take a look around at how many people are still standing that were being paid to write Ruby, either part-time or full-time, 6 years ago. 6 years is a small amount of time. You guys can all sit down. My point is that it wasn't that long ago that very few of us were being paid to write Ruby. I don't want to go back to that day. I don't want to see all of us unemployed as Rubyists. So Matz was talking about motivation in his keynote as well. And I think motivation is very, very important. Motivation is the reason that the motivation for why I'm giving this talk has a lot to do with what we just thought about, which is where would my salary be coming from right now? I'm being paid to write Ruby if it were not for the Ruby programming language. When I talk about these issues, there's kind of two responses. One of them is, everything is fine. Everything's just fine. Sure, there's problems, but it's fine. Or there may be problems, but if we just try harder, we'll just file more tickets, we'll send more patches, we'll just go faster. No matter how good that car is and how fast it's going, maybe faster than that plane, maybe it's the angle, it's never going to go in the air unless maybe it went off a cliff. Then it would be in the air for a while. The landing wouldn't be pretty. But it's basically either everything's fine or we just need to do more of what we're doing. And I don't think that's the case, so I'm going to try to convince you of that. There are other languages that vie for the money that is out there to pay Ruby developers. There's Java. There's JavaScript. Node.js. There are a lot of people who used to be at these Ruby conferences who are now doing other things with other languages. There is Clojure, a fascinating language that's getting a ton of attention. But I'm not concerned about any of those other languages. I think Ruby has some fantastic features that stand up admirably to any of those other programming languages and to any of the things that people are building in those other programming languages. The thing that I see most challenging for Ruby itself and for the viability of Ruby going forward, meaning the number of companies who are going to continue to pay people to write Ruby code, the biggest challenge I see there is actually the Ruby programming language itself. So that doesn't sound like a very good thing, and it's not. And some of the things that I want to explain up here are not feel-good things. And I know that we come to conferences, we interact with people, we enjoy hearing cool things, we get excited. The emotions of the conference rarely have to do with being disappointed or frustrated or other negative emotions. And we typically find those things difficult to dialogue about. We typically do not have conversations that are emotionally charged that turn out well. A lot of times they end up with people just saying, well, we'll just have to agree to disagree. In the Ruby community, we have a very, very good role model, right? Almost anybody that talks about the Ruby community talks about Mats. And there's that saying, Mats is nice, and so we are nice. And I think that's really important. I think that's a very, very nice thing about Ruby. A lot of people, if you look on mailing lists or places where people gather and talk, a lot of people, and even from other languages, talk about the fact that the Ruby community tends to be very inviting. That's a great thing. But just being polite is not the same as being respectful of somebody. You can be polite to your worst enemy. So I don't want us to confuse those two. And the flip side of that is that if we criticize something, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're insulting somebody. We work very hard, all of us. We do a lot of things. We pour our heart and soul into projects. And when someone says something about our projects, we take that personally. It's very, very hard not to. So please repeat after me. Everyone, I am not my code. Come on. Come on. I am not my code. I am not my code. Because we're going to talk about some things that are critical of Ruby, but we are not criticizing Mats. We are not criticizing anyone who has put their effort into Ruby, into MRI, or into any implementation of Ruby, but we need to talk about some of these things. So let's do that. So Ruby is. This is what most people associate with Ruby. Ruby and Mats' implementation of Ruby are one and the same thing. Except that there's Rubinius. This is a project that I work on. There's JRuby. That's another project that is implementing Ruby. There's maglev. There was a talk about maglev earlier today. JRuby talk after my talk, I believe, right? Yes. There's IronRuby, which we haven't heard much about, but guess what? There are commits going into the IronRuby GitHub repository. IronRuby is not dead. I know someone who is working on a Ruby implementation and making very good strides and is not talking about it publicly at all, and I think you'll be surprised when you find out about it. So there is more than one implementation of Ruby because Ruby is actually this. Ruby is just a programming language. The challenge is that because Ruby was implemented by Mats, it's his language, his implementation, the one that he tinkers with when he's like, what do I want this to do? Let me see. A lot of Ruby semantics actually merely are implementation details of MRI. It's too much to go into all those right now or really talk about that many of them, but it's a point to consider. A lot of what Ruby does is a consequence of Ruby being implemented by MRI. MRI, a Ruby implementation, is primarily C code. So all of Ruby core library, array, regex, hash, fixnum, bignum, there's all the stuff that you normally use in Ruby primarily exists in C code. And the Ruby that we use looks beautiful. The semantics of it at the level that we use it in Ruby are very nice. the things that you must do in C code to make that look so nice on top are not very nice. Some of them are very difficult. And we'll look at a couple different places where this comes out. But basically, the idea that I want you to think about for a minute is that the implementation of Ruby is primarily in C, not Ruby. So a lot of the semantics of Ruby that are very different from the semantics of C are painstakingly implemented in C. MRI also, the canonical repository is still in Subversion. There was a lot of discussion some time ago about why can't it be in Git, and now there is a Git mirror, and you can do pull requests and these sort of things. But the fact that it was in Subversion was actually something that was a discussion not about an implementation, but about the language in a way, right? It was like Ruby is possibly stagnated as a language because we can't send GitHub pull requests, sort of thing. So the choice of technology that has nothing to do with the Ruby programming language itself does potentially impact it. The bug tracker and email integration sort of stuff is in Redmine, so you go here to file a ticket. And then there are a couple different mailing lists. This is a long time, like you could go, you could read this stuff from years, but it's basically just a mailing list. This is a web interface to it, but there's one mailing list, Ruby Core, where a lot of features and discussions happen in English, and there's another Ruby mailing list called Ruby Dev, where a lot of the discussions happen in Japanese. If you are interested in learning a language, I highly recommend Japanese. It's a fascinating language. I studied it years ago before I knew anything, almost before Ruby was even created. And then I stopped. And that's a sad thing, but I'm studying it again. The problem is that most of us do not speak Japanese, and it is not an easy language to learn. It's certainly not an easy language to learn to read and write. So a lot of the discussions happening in Japanese are challenging for those of us who don't speak Japanese. So that's a very, very, very quick, like what is Ruby, what is MRI. I want to talk about some things that I see as being very challenging for Ruby itself. And I don't have any good visuals for this, but we're going to talk about ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future. Once upon a time, Mats used to release new versions of Ruby sort of around Christmas, at least a couple years he did. So there's that. What we're going to talk about for ghosts of Christmas past is the 1.8 to 1.9 transition. This was a very big change in Ruby. I think altogether it was around 7 years of work from the time that I think like early on I remember joining there was actually an English version of a development list focused on Yarv. It was still called Yarv at that time. And it did not last very long, but it was where I first sort of like, this is a project I really want to contribute to, let me get on this list. That was quite a while ago. The things that changed in 1.9 included an entire VM change. So the Ruby interpreter became an actual virtual machine, a bytecode virtual machine. Encodings were added. There were changes to I/O, and threads went from green threads to system threads, and a bunch of APIs changed. Some of those things ended up back in Ruby 1.8, right? We were probably pretty familiar with enumerators by now. They're a pretty cool feature. Those went actually back into 1.8. But most of everything else was in 1.9. After so much work and effort went into 1.9, and one thing I should point out as well is that the 1.9 semantics took a while to settle down, right? There was 1.9.0, and there was 1.9.1. And if you talk to Tony Arcieri, who wrote a RevActor that was using 1.9, one of the early like in production 1.9 things. So talk to Tony about how some of those things went. Finally, by 1.9.2, things that had been changed and then changed back, it sort of started settling down. But when all this work was done, MRI had very few tests. There were very few ways to say, this is what Ruby looks like now, where you're at in 1.8, and this is what Ruby looks like now when you're in 1.9. So when people were reluctant to upgrade, it started being like, well, why aren't you guys on 1.9 now? We've put all this work, all this effort into making it faster and better. You have real threads and stuff like that. Why won't you update? And there's a lot of people. There are still thousands of Ruby 1.8 Rails applications running out there, right? Now we're pushing 2.0, and there are still people who are reluctant to upgrade to 1.9. This is a challenge for Ruby in general. It reflects tremendously when a company is trying to decide what technology to use, and someone says, hey, I hear Clojure's really good, and someone else says, hey, I hear Ruby's good, and some of these things start getting into the discussion. This is challenging. Now we're looking at actually, the 2.0 process. And so that kind of brings us to the present. One of the things that we have in Ruby 1.9 right now is encoding. This is a very, very complex topic. I cannot do it justice. I have been working on implementing encoding in Rubinius for about 1 year. Not all the time, but a lot of that time. And a lot of what I can actually do in Rubinius, because we can operate with C and the VM is in C++, is I can actually use a lot of the work that went into extending oniguruma to support transcoding. JRuby actually re-implemented that. They have a port, essentially, as I understand it, of oniguruma. So a ton of effort has gone into this system. It's not a simple system. And one of the very interesting things is, as an implementation detail, every object can have an encoding. Now think about that for a second. What is the encoding of an array? What's the encoding of a big num? Actually, big num, I guess you could, because it's an object. Basically, these classes, these values of these classes have encodings in Ruby, but and they make sense, right? Because you're dealing with a string. A string can have an encoding. A symbol can have an encoding. A regex can have an encoding because it has a source string. But the PG gem, for instance, when it reads something from the database, at least it did at the last version that I tested, which was 0.13 or something like that, and actually had to fix a bug in Rubinius, uses this. That object can be anything. And this sets a bit in the header if the number of the index of the encoding is small enough. And so suddenly, some random object comes through the system, and it gets tagged with an encoding. I was not happy that day when I found that out. And it's also a little bit more complex than that, because it's a system where some things are legal, right? I can make that string and say it's ASCII 8-bit or binary, and I can make that string and say it's US ASCII, and then I can put them together. Or I can make that string and say it's ASCII 8-bit, and that string and say it's US ASCII, and I put them together, and what the? Also not very happy when I realized that was a feature of encodings. One of the biggest challenges here is that every single object in Ruby can have an encoding. Every single string can have a different encoding if you wanted to. And if you actually want to see what the implications of that are, start looking through code bases like Rails and look for forced encoding. There's a challenge with encodings. Not every encoding can be converted correctly if you, I guess you'd say losslessly, into another encoding. And so there's a very difficult technical challenge with an encoding system. But making it possible for every single object to have an encoding doesn't solve that problem. And having every single object have an encoding means that there are potential latent bugs like that one, which I actually spent 2 days debugging. Because encodings have to be transferred from one object to the other. And this particular bug had to do with the magic regex pseudo-globals. If you've ever used the $, apostrophe or $, ampersand, these sort of things, they basically come from Perl, I guess. You can do anything with a match data object, but they still exist. And the semantics of them, because they are scope sort of oriented, require essentially VM support. And so while match data was working just fine, in sprockets there was a regex match against this JS stuff that was coming through or CSS stuff that was coming through, and $apostrophe was used to grab the post match stuff and send it on its way. And suddenly that thing came through, was not tagged correctly, and everything was blowing up. It's the complexity of that system and the implications of that complexity for your applications that is really challenging. And it was a system that was mostly implemented completely in MRI with no real participation, certainly not by Rubinius or JRuby, which were both sort of going on at the time. And so now as we implement it, we discover all these challenging parts of that system. Ruby 2.0, we just saw a couple of discussions about Ruby 2.0 and the things that are coming. One of the biggest things that I think needs to be addressed in Ruby 2.0 is cleaning up standard lib. And it's not really on the roadmap. There's some effort to gemify things, but the gems are going to be here, and there's still going to be stuff in standard lib, as I understand it, which can create severe problems. Aaron Patterson put out a bounty on a bug where YAML was getting loaded, psych was getting loaded from the standard lib, and that made it impossible for using a newer gem that didn't have a memory leak to actually be working correctly with bundler. There's bootstrapping issues. There's a whole bunch of stuff. There's a whole bunch of complexities that are implicated by things like standard lib in Ruby 2.0, and we're revving the Ruby major number to 2.0, and we're going to tell everybody to upgrade again. And some of these major issues are not being addressed. They're not even on the radar, essentially, I think. So that's Ghosts of Christmas Present. Ghosts of Christmas Future. Keyword arguments are coming. And I think that this is a wonderful thing. There are APIs in Ruby that are so challenging to implement. Read lines can take a port name and nothing else. A port name and a limit. Where did separator go? Oh, it's going to be this by default. It's not even in there. And optional options. Or port name, separator, limit, options. And so when you're actually implementing Ruby and you're trying to like figure out what the heck you passed me for your first argument, it's pretty complicated. The C code that does this stuff is in many different places because different APIs have different things. It might be 2 optional arguments, it might be 3, they have different defaults. You basically have to put stuff everywhere. Well, we're really familiar with like defining things in Ruby. We say Ruby, def A, B is equal to nil, C is equal to 1, these sort of things. Those sort of things that we have in Ruby cannot express these APIs. We can't express that. In Rubinius, we actually have an undefined object because a lot of these APIs can take nil as a valid value. So you can't just assign nil there. You have to say, look, they really passed me no argument at all in this slot. So keyword arguments would make it possible for you to very clearly say, my port is this, my separator is this, and I could just call it with separator this, and I'm done, right? I have that. The question is, and I don't know the answer to this, will these APIs be fixed in 2.0 to all use those keyword arguments? If we have keyword arguments, will those be fixed so that we can actually sanely implement these sort of things? And the other thing is think about the complexity of that stuff for your code. If you're reading through some code and you get to IO read lines, which may or may not be the bug you're trying to figure out, and it has IO read lines A, so some value passed through from who knows where, and you don't know whether that's the port name and separator, port name and limit, right? Whether it could be options. Okay, so that's one of the things. Will those APIs actually be updated in Ruby 2.0? Refinements. So I was hoping and praying that refinements were not going to be in Ruby 2.0, and Mats dashed my hopes today at his keynote. And someone immediately tweets what I consider to be my biggest concern about refinements. I can't wait to use these things in libraries. So here's the challenge. Managing complexity is the challenge. We write libraries to help us manage complexity. These libraries, as you know, never have bugs in them, right? You never have to spend a full day debugging sprockets. Has anybody spent a full day debugging sprockets? Raise your hand if you have. Oh, way more people than I thought. Is that something that you looked forward to? The next day, did you get up and say, oh, dang it, I don't get to debug sprockets today. I finished that yesterday. Did anybody do that? I didn't. No way. No. So the number one thing that refinements adds is complexity. I think it's our most important challenge in making software is managing complexity. If you went to Koichi's talk, I'm pretty sure that was on his slide. This is about Ruby Dispatch. Ruby Dispatch is implicated in refinements. And if one instance of monkey patching is bad, how do n possible instances, where n is countably infinite, countably, you might be able to count all those n's, how can that be okay? I want someone to tell me that. Active support. The sort of things that active support does are often arguments for refinements. I'll give you an alternative argument. Active support exists because Ruby didn't get fixed. We have array shuffle, but we don't have a lot of the things that people have found tremendously useful in active support and are using in libraries completely divorced from Ruby because they are very, very useful. Lack of tools is probably the number one thing that inhibits our ability to understand our Ruby code. It's not because someone changed a string method somewhere. You know what's so easy to add to Ruby? If you want to know where a method is defined, you can get the file and line number. If you pull up Rubinius and you do like string.method plus, it'll tell you exactly where it's defined. If you overwrite it, it will tell you exactly where it was overridden. It's not hard to understand where these things are overridden, right? It's not hard to understand what was actually changed on that one single method. I challenge anyone to understand where n of those methods might exist and might implicate the bug that you're trying to track down, right? Because again, there are never bugs in these libraries that we depend on. Who has like made a new Rails app recently and run bundle and be like, whoop, that many gems go by? And have you looked at the code in those gems? It's a lot of code. Fear is the number one reason to use refinements. And it's the number one reason why library authors will use refinements. Because they're like, I don't want my code to be blamed. You broke it. But because it broke my code, I'm going to get blamed. And so, you know what? I'll make it so you can't break my code. But as soon as you do that, you have this one place where this method is overridden, and then this other place, and then this other place. And some of the amazing and beautiful things you can do with Ruby, like open a class and redefine a method, suddenly can't be done anymore. The fact that Rubinius can boot the core library written in Ruby depends vitally on the ability for us to define a very simple method that can get us to the next step in bootstrapping, so we can redefine that to the complex behavior that Ruby actually has. It's fundamental. And that sort of bootstrapping scenario can be used in a lot of different places. So there's really no code at all that needs refinements. Refinements are not an extraction of something. They're not like, we found this to be really useful over here, therefore we sort of refine that idea into an abstraction, and now it becomes a language feature. They're an implementation burden. There is no comprehensive documentation, and there are exactly zero, a giant zero Ruby specs for refinements. There are some tests. And they're going to have unintended consequences. No one has built a library using refinements yet that's out there in production code that I know of. I would love to see it. And instead, there are actual problems for Ruby that we should be focusing on. Very serious problems for Ruby. Number one problem, concurrency. Every single CPU that's being built today is being built with more and more cores. Concurrency is vital. If we want to be relevant, if we want to continue to be writing Ruby code, we have to understand concurrency. This guy, Tony, is at this conference. You should go give him a handshake, a hug. He is working on a project called Celluloid that will do 1,000 million times more for Ruby than refinements will do, because it's bringing the ability to abstract concurrency and make it more understandable in code. Concurrency needs a memory model. You need to be able to say, if I update an instance variable on this object in this thread, what do the other threads in this system see as that value? There's nothing that's defined. It's ad hoc right now. JRuby has a memory model based on top of JVM, I think. Rubinius is also trying to define a memory model. There are multiple implementations of Ruby. Your code can't behave differently when you update things from two different threads if we don't have a consistent memory model. We must deal with this problem. An extension API. In Rubinius, we go to great lengths to make it possible for people to write C extensions and run them that are running on MRI and run them on Rubinius. We have a different garbage collector that moves objects. The MRI garbage collector does not move objects, and people write extensions thinking that objects will always be there, or that they can randomly write into the guts of a string because it's just a char array, or that they can randomly write into the guts of an array because it's just a C array. So we have to do a lot of things to make these things work, and there are some things that we cannot do in a thread-safe way. So we used to put a big global lock around the C extension API. We took that lock away because basically Evan Dierkjan and I sat down and I said, look, if things are going to break because they're broken, I want to see them break now, not later. So we took that lock out. You can add it if you want it. But we took it out so that threads can run in parallel, right, if your hardware supports it. But there's a lot of things that actually have to be fixed with the C API. The JVM has JNI. They've dealt with this problem. It's a solved problem. There's a way to do it. In order for us to be able to have multiple implementations that can use C libraries, like imagine something as complex as encoding that could have been shared across all these different implementations if we had a sane extension API. These sorts of things are really important for the viability of Ruby. And finally, one more, security. Rain is giving a talk about security. It's not about security of Ruby, but it's about security concepts, and it's something that people need to understand. We need to really, as a community, raise the level of awareness about security. In Ruby, pardon me, we have three kind of things. People use freeze to implement some levels of security. Taint and untrust. I don't even understand how those things work. What I do know from working a lot in building Rubinius is that there's a lot of places in MRI code that check things like taint and trust. If you mess up one of those places, what happens? You have a hole. Security is a problem that the JVM and other languages have looked at and addressed. There may be more than their approach to the problem, but an actual approach that looks at what we need for security and implementing that in a way that's a defined semantic so that every Ruby implementation can do it the same is something that we're missing right now. Those things like freeze and taint and stuff like that are basically hacks for Ruby. Instead of hacking on Ruby, finally, I want to talk about designing Ruby. And the number one thing that I think that Ruby needs is a design committee. And I know that's a horrible thought. We are all a little bit anarchist, I think, in our core as Rubyists, because Ruby is a wonderful language. The dynamism of Ruby means that we can do things, and no one tells us you can't do that until sometimes, not ever, and sometimes very late in the code, right? You can redefine methods, you can make up classes on the fly, you can add and remove methods, you can do all kinds of things in Ruby, tons of things in Ruby. I love that about Ruby. I don't want someone to tell me you can't do that, right? Design committees raise the specter of a lot of people, I think, arguing unproductively, and our freedom is basically at stake. I think that's the perception that I get, but I don't think that's the case. The reason why I think a design committee is very important is that because we have multiple different stakeholders, We have companies, some of them very, very big companies, who are very interested in Ruby. And for them, it's not so much about whether developers are happy. Most job descriptions don't say, as one of your duties, we'd like you to be happy, right? You create value for the company that justifies what they pay you, or you don't have a job. And it's great for us to want to be happy, and I am happy programming Ruby code, and I would like many, many people to continue to be happy programming Ruby code. But if we don't allow the stakeholders a say, if we don't let them talk about things and decide things, then they'll say, okay, fine. I have a lot of money. I can make my own implementation. That's already happened. So far, no one has been willing to say, you know what? Actually, I'm not just making an implementation of Ruby, but I'm going to make my own implementation of Ruby. And that's the thing that really scares me. So the Ruby design committee is not just random. I think that it needs to be a committee of representatives from implementations. And the reason for that is that when we get to these actual things, people who actually have a vested interest, we will do far less random and irrelevant discussions about things and much more focused work. I think that a proposed change to Ruby, coming from one of the Ruby design committee members or representatives, has to include these things. Number one, documentation. We don't just write some code and say, this is a feature that I like, here it is, play with it. We define it in documentation that people can read and discuss. It must have Ruby spec coverage. It must have an implementation by all members of the committee, all members of the Ruby design committee. After the implementation is where we debate things. And finally, we vote. And it's a consensus. No one says, well, we really like this, you don't like it, too bad. Part of making the case is actually showing this code in these libraries or this application or this way causes these consequences and these costs. If we change it, we would have this sort of thing. The number one thing that we need to avoid is bike shedding, which is wasting an inordinate amount of time on totally irrelevant details, or having people come in and say, Ruby really needs types. Types don't make sense in Ruby. There are a ton of typed programming languages out there. We don't need them for performance. We don't need them for code clarity. We don't need them. So I want to avoid, in this my ideal world here of Ruby design, I want to avoid this as much as possible. Adding documentation is the first way of making it so someone can't just drop in and say, yo, what about adding like optional typing to Ruby, which has happened repeatedly on Ruby core. The second thing is that if we add Ruby specs, then we have a way to communicate with all the implementations and actually run code and check and see if it works. And the reason that I insist on Ruby spec, here is an example of code from the MRI tests. And a couple problems with this are, I can't understand it. That's the first problem. It's got embedded in it things like bugs in MRI, which have no bearing whatsoever on Ruby. It's a bug in MRI, the implementation. It combines a whole bunch of stuff into one thing. And it doesn't have very good coverage. This is Ruby specs coverage for string IO gets. These are the tests for string IO gets. So if you want to learn more about Ruby spec, please visit rubyspec.org. But I think that Ruby spec is vital to making the Ruby design process better because it cares about implementations. It has first-class support for implementations and the differences that may exist and may have to exist between implementations because what someone's using to implement Ruby may simply not give you something that you need. And so there has to be a way to say, on this implementation, this can't happen, or it has to happen this way. It has explicit support for platforms. There are a lot of platforms that run Ruby, and there are a lot of differences between those platforms and what are provided in the CLib API. And then there are support for versions. Just because Ruby 2.0 comes out and a bunch of people go and use Ruby 2.0 does not mean that all the people that invested money and paid people to write applications that run on Ruby 1.9 have money to pay those people to go make sure it runs on 2.0. If we do not respect the investment that people have made in Ruby and Ruby applications, we will not have respect from those people, and they will not be very likely to say, you know what, it's a great idea that you want to write my new application in Ruby. I received such respect for my investment last time, I would like you to do that again. I want people to say that, but they're not going to say that if we don't respect the investment that people have made in previous versions. And finally, the debate after implementation means that we get to talk about what actually matters. I've implemented this to the best of my ability, check my implementation, I don't think there's bugs, it passes all of Ruby spec, and it has this adverse consequence, which I think is a deal breaker. These sorts of discussions we can actually have those after implementation. And for supporting technology, we need a way to talk about stuff that doesn't result in this. Mailing lists and forums that thread things like this hurt my brain so badly I cannot deal with it. There has to be a way to say, on this point of this implementation, these are the responses, these things make sense. Not this threaded, but then you responded to this, and then I responded. This is just a very short thread. And I picked Hacker News because it has a horrible interface, I think. I don't know. People spend a lot of time on Hacker News. I honestly don't know how that works. But I think that we need technology to support it. We actually need an application that discusses proposed changes to Ruby and has ways to check off all the things that we need to do. The reason that I don't think Ruby core is sufficient is because it's a mailing list that mixes MRI bugs with other features. And the volume is overwhelming. And I thought it was just me until I saw Charlie say, oh, I started looking at Ruby core again, and then they went on a big bug sweep. And I'm like, yeah, I can't read all of that stuff. It's so much stuff. And I do want to participate. And finally, discussions have to happen in English. Not all the discussions. And I'm sorry if this sounds culturally imperialist or something, but the fact is that the language that we typically use to discuss things is English. We can all discuss, if a Russian team made an implementation and they discussed all of their implementation stuff in Russian and then came and said, okay, here's what we think, that dialogue right there has to happen in English because that is the language that the vast majority of us share, and the things that have been discussed completely in Japanese before have been very, very challenging for us to understand and us to implement. So this is the proposal. You make a proposal, you add Ruby specs, you do the implementation, there's a discussion, and there's a vote. That's my pie-in-the-sky vision of what a Ruby design committee and process would be. JFK said, those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. We've seen that happen in the world. I say, those who make collaboration impossible make forking inevitable. Since I started working on Ruby spec years and years ago, my #1 concern, and before I was even willing to contribute to Rubinius, was that Ruby itself as a language and a community did not get fragmented and split apart by competing interests, that we maintained Ruby as a language that brought everybody together. I don't want to see this happen. Even more importantly, I was having a discussion with somebody the other day, and they said, you know, I've always wondered what a dying open source project looks like. And I thought, because we were actually talking about Ruby at that time, I wonder what a dying language looks like. Please don't let Ruby die. It's a beautiful language. I love Ruby very much, and I think most of us do. So here's my conclusion. Matsumoto-san, thank you very much for Ruby. It's a beautiful, powerful language. It brings many people such joy. Your creation is a gift to the world. But Ruby is now over 18 years old. Please set it free to fulfill its destiny.